She didn't ask for applause, didn't stand on a stage. She just held out a hand-drawn picture, a swan on a pond with three small figures holding hands. And across the room, Donald Trump laughed. Messy, not princess material. That's all he said. But it was enough to shatter the quiet in the room and erase the smile from a 9-year-old girl who thought she was safe. Before anyone moved, before anyone else could speak, a royal guard broke formation, spoke a single sentence and called for Prince William directly. Because some titles may be inherited, but protection is always earned. Now, before we show you what happened next, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell icon. This is a moment you'll want to remember. It was the kind of morning that didn't make headlines. No fanfare, no motorcades. Just a handful of names on a schedule and a narrow corridor on the eastern side of Buckingham Palace, far removed from the throne room or ceremonial halls. The Children's Learning Gallery was never meant for statecraft. It was quiet, curated for soft-footed visitors, and filled with sketches, books, and watercolour maps of the royal grounds, drawn by former monarchs when they were young. This was where the crown raised its children with a gentle hand. Princess Charlotte sat at a long oak table near the centre of the gallery, surrounded by pastels and thick paper stock. Her cardigan sleeves were rolled halfway up, and her focus was fixed, not on the adults whispering by the door, but on the small figure she was tracing at the edge of her page. Her face didn't show tension or nerves. She wasn't performing for an audience, and she was drawing for herself. 2 educational liaisons stood nearby, one with a soft tablet for notes, the other gently rotating the coloured pencils in their tray. A developmental consultant observed quietly from a side chair. Her role was not correction, but observation. At 9 years old, Charlotte was in that narrow space between innocence and awareness. And in moments like these, the palace prioritised letting her lead rather than impress. Guarding her, though no one would have noticed at first glance, stood Sergeant Callum Wren. Mid-30s, composed, immaculately dressed in red and navy, he held no weapon in hand, nor expression on his face, but his post, 4 paces behind and slightly offset from Charlotte's working table, was deliberate. He belonged to the Royal Guard's close juvenile detail, a small rotation of highly trained personnel assigned not for combat readiness, but for emotional discretion. Wren was here because he could read a room without speaking, and defend without disrupting. He had done both before. Today's visit had been marked low exposure on the palace rotation log, a cultural diplomacy exchange involving a private American delegation and a brief walk-through of curated spaces within the palace grounds. Among them was Donald Trump, present in a non-head of state capacity following an off-calendar meeting with a UK official the day prior. His request to see educational initiatives had been cleared late, but approved nonetheless. A gesture of courtesy, not ceremony. There were no cameras, no press pool, no expectation of speeches or gifts. Just a few guests, a hallway of aides, and a protected space meant for children to simply be children. Charlotte didn't know the full schedule. She only knew what she wanted to finish before they left. The gallery had become her quiet corner of the week, and today she'd chosen to draw something private. Something she might give to her mother. Wren watched her lift her pencil, pause and press again. The light in the room softened. The air was calm. But calm is not the same as safe, and not all breaches come through doors. She hadn't asked if it was good. She hadn't needed to. The drawing sat on the table in front of her, finished but still held with care, like it was waiting to be understood before it could be moved. A soft pastel sketch on thick white paper. The palace gardens as she remembered them from a rainy morning the week before the narrow footbridge over the shallow pond, a single swan drifting under an arched tree branch, and 3 small figures on the path, 2 tall, 1 smaller, drawn without faces, but with their hands linked in a way that said everything without needing names. Charlotte had made the decision herself. The day's scheduled exercise had been creative reflection, with options ranging from clay shaping to watercolour study. But she'd asked for pencils, not to copy something, to draw something of her own. The adults had agreed, No one had suggested themes. They didn't need to. The child knew what she wanted to say. She hadn't rushed. There were small, careful erase marks on the paper's edge, where she'd adjusted the length of a sleeve, repositioned a tree, smoothed out the ripples in the pond. She worked without speaking, without performing. The kind of work children only do when they forget they're being watched. Sergeant Wren hadn't moved, but he'd seen the shift. The first 20 minutes had been technical, her strokes light, observational, but something had changed near the end. Her lines became softer, more layered, her posture more still. It was no longer an assignment. It was a message, one meant for someone else, one she hoped would be seen. And when the sound of adult footsteps reached the outer corridor, Charlotte didn't startle. She didn't fold the paper away. She picked it up gently, held it in both hands, and waited. The delegation entered softly, as expected. Aides made room. Names were exchanged. Mr. Trump, flanked by 2 diplomatic guests and a cultural envoy, stepped forward without the usual entourage. He wore a navy coat and light blue tie, slightly wind-blown from the short walk across the forecourt. His demeanour was relaxed, smiling, slightly animated, clearly treating the visit as a pleasant detour. His eyes moved quickly around the room. He nodded at the staff. He glanced at the decor, and then he saw Charlotte. She stood near the centre, picture in hand, feet still slightly apart the way she'd been taught. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't afraid either. She was waiting for the right kind of attention, the kind that makes a child feel seen, not judged. He noticed the drawing, tilted his head, stepped forward. Charlotte extended it toward him, not forcefully, not for praise, just as a gesture. Something she was proud of, something small but hers. "It's the pond behind the palace," she said quietly, "with Mummy and Papa, and me." Trump took it with both hands, nodding. The moment should have stopped there, but it didn't. Trump didn't mean harm. That's what made it harder to name. He stepped further into the gallery with that familiar half-confident gait, shoulders slightly forward, arms relaxed at his sides, glancing briefly at the high ceilings before locking eyes on the first point of interest, Charlotte and the drawing in his hands. His expression was not cruel. It was the smile of a man walking into a room where he assumed he'd already been accepted, where charm replaced context, where confidence filled the silence others might approach more gently. The other visitors watched him carefully, unsure whether to follow or wait. One of the aides offered a soft nod to the instructor, who returned it with an equally muted signal. The consultant scribbled something into her notes and then folded the tablet closed. Charlotte didn't move. She waited, still holding her breath in that invisible way children do when they're hopeful but uncertain. Trump held the drawing up, tilting it under the skylight. The page fluttered slightly in the warmth of the air vent. He furrowed his brow, not unkindly but theatrically, the way someone might when trying to conjure a joke from thin air. "Now what am I looking at here?" he said with a low chuckle, eyes flicking between the paper and the group. "Is this a goose in the bathtub or one of those abstract things?" There was a pause. Someone behind him, one of the envoys, let out a faint breath of amusement, unsure whether to laugh or look away. Trump continued, still holding the picture like it was a riddle. "It's messy. Not exactly royal, is it? Not princess material," he added with a grin, letting the phrase hang. The gallery went silent in that peculiar way, where no one quite knows whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. The instructors stood frozen, lips parted slightly but without words. The consultant's eyes locked onto Charlotte. One aide stepped forward a half-inch, then stopped herself. Charlotte didn't cry, she didn't speak, but her body reacted first. Her arms folded in, subtle, protective. Her weight shifted to one leg. She looked down, not at the floor, but at her shoes. Her shoulders, once drawn back in pride, curved just slightly inward. A child trying to stay tall in a moment, suddenly too large for her. Trump, unaware, turned to the others and held up the page again. "Look, I'm just saying, when I was a kid, I couldn't draw either. No big deal." But it was a big deal. Not because of the drawing, because of where it happened, who it came from, and who had just told a child that what she made wasn't enough. Sergeant Wren remained still. His hands did not move, his face did not shift, but beneath the bearskin, his jaw had locked into position. He had not broken formation, yet. The paper didn't fall. That's what surprised Sergeant Wren the most. When Trump handed it back, carelessly, one hand, no eye contact, it bent slightly at the corner, as though the weight of the moment had transferred into the page itself. Charlotte reached out with both hands, her fingers steady but slower than before. She took it gently without speaking and returned it to the table in front of her, smoothing the edge where it had creased. She didn't look up. No one said anything for a full 5 seconds. Not the instructors, not the aides, not the consultant. Even Trump seemed to notice the sudden quiet, but he misread it. He assumed it was the polite kind. The kind that followed a joke no one found very funny, but everyone would soon move past. He clapped his hands softly once, breaking the silence. "She's got plenty of time to learn," he said, waving a hand towards Charlotte, like she wasn't standing 3 feet away. "She's what? 8? 9? I mean, come on, I've seen worse. My son once drew a dog with 6 legs." A few staff forced weak smiles, habit more than agreement. A social reflex, but their eyes had already moved elsewhere. To Charlotte, she hadn't moved since placing the drawing back down. Her chin stayed tilted slightly toward her chest, eyes on the table. Her shoes didn't shift. Her hands remained folded in her lap, thumbs rubbing lightly together in small circular motions. Self-soothing behavior. Textbook. The consultant reached slowly for her tablet again. Aide number 2. Turned toward the door, searching for someone who wasn't there. And behind them all, Sergeant Wren recalibrated. His assignment today had been classified as low threat, low contact, non-intervention. A tier typically reserved for diplomatic showings where no physical proximity breach was expected and no safeguarding protocol was likely to activate. But this wasn't a threat to safety. It was a threat to dignity. He scanned the scene silently. No royal parent present. No senior staff stepping in. No press, but 3 witnesses from the diplomatic corps. A violation of emotional protocol, not physical. A minor, non-consensual social target. No escalation from Charlotte, but visible distress cues. His training had not been designed for this exact scenario, but one of his prior instructors, years ago at Sandhurst, had said something that returned to him now. A guard doesn't wait for a punch. He waits for a principle. Wren's weight shifted, barely perceptible. His right foot pivoted 5 degrees outward. His gloved hand flexed once, then relaxed. His breathing slowed. One of the aides glanced at him instinctively. That was enough. Protocol hadn't been broken yet, but the threshold had been reached. Charlotte's voice, when it finally came, was almost too soft to hear. "It's not a goose," she said. Trump, turning back toward her, looked confused. "It's a swan," she clarified, barely above a whisper. "They're always in pairs." And then she fell silent again. But the moment was already rebalancing. Aides moved quietly into position near the door. One slipped out with a tap of their comm device. The consultant stood, adjusting her scarf with a glance toward Wren, as if confirming that they were now both operating under silent alert. Trump looked around, puzzled. "Was something wrong with what I said?" No one answered, because at that point it no longer mattered what he meant. What mattered was what the child had heard, and the guard behind her had just entered a different state of duty. Sergeant Wren had been trained to recognize more than threats. His selection for close juvenile detail hadn't been due to marksmanship or parade precision. It had come after 18 months embedded across ceremonial, diplomatic and domestic service, during which he had demonstrated a consistent ability to detect subtle escalation, emotional volatility, social temperature shifts, and the kind of unspoken distress that no one else acknowledged until it was too late. And now, standing 4 paces behind a child who hadn't moved in almost a full minute, he saw it again. Not panic, not fear, collapse. silent, internal, and tightly contained. The kind that left no evidence behind except for the way Charlotte's fingertips pressed into her knees, or how her chin tilted 1 degree lower than it had before. There was no crying, no protest, just retreat. Withdrawal into a mental corner that children create when they've been publicly embarrassed by someone too large to contradict. This wasn't a behavioral shift, it was a wound. Ren's eyes didn't move, but his focus narrowed. He began scanning what his protocol referred to as emotional containment readiness factors. Is the child able to self-regulate without intervention? Are nearby adults prepared to reframe or de-escalate? Does the source of distress present continued verbal pressure? Are parental figures present? Is the child's emotional body language registering across the room? The answers came quickly. No. No. Possibly. No. Only to him. He shifted his stance. Fractional. Precise. Not enough to signal alarm, but enough for the palace aide to notice. She turned subtly, eyes flicking toward him for confirmation. He gave no expression. He didn't need to. The gesture had already said enough. A second aide quietly began preparing a fallback procedure, not an evacuation, just a realignment of roles. A consultant approached the child's instructor and whispered something inaudible. The facilitator nodded. Trump, meanwhile, continued speaking, gesturing toward the gallery's artwork as if nothing were wrong. Lovely space, really. Bit old-fashioned, but warm, cozy. I don't remember ever doing stuff like this. Probably would have made me soft, he chuckled. Charlotte hadn't moved. Her breathing had changed, shorter now, more from the chest. Ren's left hand twitched once inside his glove. The line had not yet been crossed, but it was now within reach. There was a final element he hadn't yet assessed. One that all Royal Juvenile Guards were trained to monitor, but rarely needed to act upon. Emotional proxy override. It was a little-known clause in internal child safeguarding protocol. If a royal minor experienced psychological harm in the absence of parental presence or senior royal representation, and no adult on site intervened, then a royal guard was permitted to activate direct chain of command recall. It had never been exercised in his career, but it existed for a reason. He took one breath, then exhaled slowly. And in his mind, the choice became clear. This was no longer about art. It was no longer about what had been said. It was about the silence that had followed, and what it told a child about who would speak for her when no one else did. Ren's spine straightened. His right heel aligned directly behind his left. His chin lifted 1 degree. His lips remained closed. But internally the decision was complete. He would break formation, not to protect her from violence, but to ensure the room remembered that royalty begins not with bloodlines or titles, but with how we treat the ones too small to defend themselves. It happened so quietly that half the room didn't register it at first. Sergeant Wren didn't move his feet. He didn't lower his rifle. He didn't clear his throat or announce anything aloud. All he did, exactly 1 minute and 23 seconds after Princess Charlotte set her drawing down, was speak. "Sir," he said, requesting the presence of the child's primary guardian. His voice was low, level, unhurried. It didn't echo through the gallery. It didn't need to. The acoustics were sharp enough, the air still enough, that the words landed like a small bell in an empty hall. Donald Trump turned first, eyebrows raised in confusion. "What?" he said, a slight laugh in his voice. "Sorry, is something going on?" Wren didn't respond to him directly. His eyes had already shifted, briefly, to the aide by the exit. "Guardian protocol is now active," he said simply. The aide blinked, processing the phrase. Guardian protocol. A phrase that only appeared in security briefings, never in public dialogue. It meant the environment had changed. Not externally, internally. And not because of violence or breach. Because someone had forgotten the weight of a child's silence. The first instructor instinctively stepped back. The consultant rose from her chair. One of the cultural guests began reaching for her coat, sensing something had shifted without knowing what. Trump looked around the room, still trying to read the silence. "Is this about me?" he asked, half to himself. "Look, I was just saying the drawing." Wren's voice didn't rise. "This interaction is no longer classified as observational," he said calmly. "Emotional proxy transfer has been initiated." The language was precise, procedural, undeniable. The aide at the door lifted her comms receiver to her ear. Wren's eyes never left Charlotte, not in scrutiny, but in awareness. Her hands remained folded, her shoulders still curled slightly inward. But her breathing had begun to slow. She had heard him. She didn't turn, but she knew. And a moment that had felt isolating now carried a new weight behind it. The room remained still, until 30 seconds later, a secondary door on the far end opened, and Prince William stepped inside. He didn't enter quickly. Prince William stepped through the far door with a calmness that made the room go even quieter. No aides flanked him, no fanfare, just polished shoes on wood, measured and steady. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't ask questions. His eyes found Charlotte immediately. She was still seated at the table, posture straight but not tense. The drawing sat in front of her, untouched. Her hands remained folded in her lap. William walked directly to her. No ceremony, no commentary, just a farther closing distance. He crouched beside her chair, not kneeling entirely, but low enough to meet her at eye level. She turned her head, barely, and their eyes met. "Was there something you wanted to show me?" he asked gently. Charlotte nodded once. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders softened. She reached for the paper again and held it up. William studied it carefully, not with forced praise or theatrical surprise. He took it in the way parents do when they know the child is watching, not their reaction, but their respect. "It's the bridge," he said quietly, "and the swan." Charlotte gave the smallest nod. "That's you," he added, pointing to the smallest figure. "You put us all together." She looked down again, but not in retreat, just in acknowledgement. Only then did William straighten. He turned, not to Charlotte's instructors, not to the aides, but toward Trump. There was no accusation in his face, no raised voice, just clarity. "I understand there was a comment made about my daughter's drawing," he said. "Is that correct?" Trump shifted slightly. He smiled awkwardly, holding his palms out in mock surrender. "Look, it was just a joke. You know how kids are, drawings and scribbles. I was just teasing, meant nothing by it." William didn't smile. "Teasing is what we do when we know someone feels safe enough to laugh with us," he replied. "That wasn't this." Trump opened his mouth, paused, then let it close again. William continued, tone quiet but precise. "A drawing like this doesn't need to be impressive. It's not supposed to meet a standard. It exists because she made it, and because she chose to share it." He looked down again at Charlotte, who was watching him from the corner of her eye. "That is the entire point of royalty," he said, softly, but for the room to hear. "Not to be admired, but to protect what's too easily dismissed." Charlotte blinked once, then lowered the drawing gently back to the table. Sergeant Wren hadn't moved. But the shift was visible in the air now, no longer just tension, but redefinition. Trump didn't speak again. And in the silence that followed, no one doubted who had just led the room. Prince William didn't look angry. That was what made his words land heavier than any raised voice could have. He stayed near Charlotte's side, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, not possessive, not shielding, just there, present. Then he looked up and spoke, not just to Trump, but to the room. "There are people who think royalty is about crowns, titles, applause, but it isn't. Not really." His voice was steady, conversational even, but his gaze didn't waver. "It's about who we choose to listen to, who we protect when no one else is looking, and how we treat someone who's just handed us something they made, with both hands." A few of the instructors shifted uncomfortably. The consultant stood entirely still. Even the cultural envoy, who had been silently reviewing her schedule, now stood with her arms loosely crossed, watching every word. William continued, his tone never rising. When a child creates something and says, "Here, this is for you," they're not asking for judgment. They're trusting you to hold it with care. He turned slightly towards Charlotte, his voice softening. Even if it's messy, even if it's simple, even if it looks like something no one else understands, it matters, because it was hers. Charlotte blinked slowly. Her expression hadn't changed much, but her fingers had relaxed against the edge of the page. She was listening, not just hearing, listening. Trump gave a short exhale, half apology, half deflection. "I didn't mean to upset her. Look, I didn't know what it was, that's all." William didn't flinch. "It's a swan," he said. "Not a goose. They always mate in pairs." A pause. "They're quiet, protective, and they'll do whatever it takes to shield what they care about." He didn't need to elaborate. The metaphor hung in the air, fully formed. Trump gave a small, unreadable nod and said nothing else. William turned back to Charlotte. This time, he knelt fully. "You drew something real. And I'm proud of that," he said, voice low. "One day this will hang in a very quiet place, where only people who understand its meaning will ever see it." Charlotte didn't smile, but her shoulders lifted slightly, as if some invisible weight had eased. Then William stood, and with no fanfare, no announcement and no ceremony, he reached forward and took the drawing, not to archive it or make it disappear, but simply to hold it. 2 hands, carefully, like it was made of glass. He turned to Sergeant Wren, who had not moved a muscle since his intervention, and gave a single nod. Wren returned it in silence, the barest tilt of his chin. No salute, no words, because none were needed. The moment had been restored, not reversed, not avenged, restored. There were no apologies issued, no headlines drafted, no formal statements prepared by the Palace communications team. What had happened in the Children's Learning Gallery that morning wouldn't become a public incident, nor would it reach the evening briefings delivered to royal press liaisons. It didn't need to, because not every correction required public acknowledgement. Some only needed to be understood by the people who were in the room. The aides moved smoothly, wordlessly reconfiguring the final 20 minutes of the tour. One offered to escort the remaining visitors to the adjoining Gallery of Young Monarchs, a polite redirection under the guise of scheduling logistics. Another gently stepped between the consultant and the guests, resetting the pacing of the walk to keep attention off Charlotte. Trump didn't linger. He nodded once toward William, mumbled something inaudible, likely an attempt at parting courtesy, and allowed himself to be ushered out with the rest of the group. His expression was neutral, not chastened, but aware. The kind of look that suggested he'd realized the rules of the space were different, and he'd been operating in the wrong register the whole time. Back in the gallery, the room began to breathe again. Charlotte remained seated. She hadn't asked to leave. She didn't need to. The atmosphere around her had changed, not dramatically, but meaningfully. The tension had been removed. The air no longer felt fragile. She looked down at the blank sheet next to her, then up at her father. "Can I start another one?" she asked softly. William smiled, not the kind used for photographers, but the one reserved for bedtime and breakfast and quiet corners of the palace. "Of course," he said. Charlotte reached for a new pencil, her fingers now steady. Sergeant Wren resumed his station. His stance hadn't faltered once during the entire exchange. And yet, as Charlotte began her new drawing, he adjusted his posture by half a degree, just enough to shield her view from the far side of the hallway. Not a command, a gesture, a reminder that she was seen, and that no matter what anyone else said in passing, her place in that room had never changed. By the time the visitors had cleared the west corridor, the sky outside had begun to dim. Afternoon clouds gathered softly over the palace courtyard, muting the daylight into a pale wash against the gallery windows. One of the aides moved to switch on the interior sconces, but Charlotte shook her head gently. "I like it this way." So the room stayed grey and quiet. Her new drawing had no people in it, just trees, a single curved path, and a pond in the centre, its water shaded lightly with green and grey, as if the reflection hadn't decided what to become yet. She wasn't rushing. She drew with the same slow focus as before, but this time without watching who was behind her. Prince William remained nearby, speaking softly with the consultant about deferring the remainder of the day's engagements. He didn't need to be told how close it had come, how quickly small harm can become a memory that lingers longer than it should. Sergeant Wren remained at his post, 4 paces back, just to the left of her shoulder, still, silent, unshifting, until Charlotte spoke again. "Can he keep it?" William looked down. "Who?" "The guard." She didn't look at Wren, but her voice was clear. "The first one, the swan drawing." William studied her expression, serious, composed. Then he turned to Wren. "Sergeant?" Wren stepped forward, only once, and removed a thin envelope from the inner pocket of his tunic. He had already folded the drawing, creased gently, no hard lines, and sealed it before returning to position. He hadn't planned to ask for it, but he'd preserved it anyway. Now as he extended the envelope forward, Charlotte didn't take it. She only nodded once. Wren gave a slight bow, then stepped back. It wasn't a gift, it was a handoff of trust. And in a palace that had seen centuries of crowns, titles and declarations, this one needed no inscription, because it had been carried out in the one language a child understands more than any other. Someone stood for me, even when I didn't ask. Should a royal guard ever be allowed to break silence, if it means defending a child's dignity? And do you think Donald Trump realized how much damage a single sentence can do? Let us know what you think in the comments. We read every single one. If you believe some things are worth protecting, tap the like button, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story. And don't forget to share this video with someone who still believes royalty is just about titles. Your next Royal Guard story is already up on your screen. Click it now and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new video.